The day Sarah Ashvale was given to the enemy king, no one in her pack cried for her. She stood in the great hall of her people, with a white dress that did not fit her properly, and shoes that were half a size too small. The elders of her pack stood in a line behind her, their eyes fixed on the stone floor. Not one of them looked at her face, not one of them said goodbye. She was 22 years old, and she had already learned that silence was the safest thing a person could carry. The treaty had been signed the week before. 3 years of war between the Ashvale pack and the Vorn Empire had ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. The Ashvale lands were burned. Their numbers were thin. When the Vorn king sent his terms, the elders agreed to everything, including the final condition at the bottom of the page. One woman, an unmarried female of the pack, delivered to the king as a symbol of the agreement. They chose Sarah without much discussion. She was quiet. She caused no trouble. She had no suitors, no important role, and no one who would grieve loudly if she was taken. She was, as one elder put it in a voice he thought she could not hear, easy to spare. Sarah heard him. She always heard things people believed she could not. She did not argue. She packed one bag, put on the dress, and walked out of the hall that had been her home for 22 years without looking back. King Aldrich Draven was everything the stories described and nothing more. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the kind of authority that made rooms go quiet the moment he entered them. He had dark eyes that moved quickly and a jaw that never seemed to relax. He had built the Vorn Empire into the most powerful wolf kingdom in the region through strategy, discipline, and a reputation for never making the same mistake twice. He met Sarah for exactly 4 minutes on the day of the marriage ceremony. He signed the documents. He nodded at the priest. He looked at Sarah once, briefly, in the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he has been told to accept into his home. Then he walked away to attend a council meeting. Sarah was shown to a room in the east wing by a young servant girl named Pella, who was kind but nervous. The room was clean and had a window that looked out over a walled garden. Pella told her, apologetically, that she was not expected at dinner. She was not expected at any official gathering until further notice. She was not expected anywhere. Pella left. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the garden below, and breathed slowly. She had known, walking into this palace, that she would not be welcomed. She had prepared herself for coldness, for distance, for being treated as what she was in the treaty, a footnote. What she had not expected was how completely she would be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Sarah built a life for herself in the quiet spaces of the palace. She woke before dawn and walked the garden while the rest of the palace still slept. The garden was overgrown and sad, as though it had not been properly tended in years. She began working on it slowly, asking Pella for seeds and tools, spending her mornings in the soil. She learned the palace by watching it. She learned which hallways were used for official business and which ones the servants used to move quickly. She learned the names of the guards on her corridor and then the guards on the floors above. She asked about their families when they mentioned them. She remembered the details. A guard named Fenric had a daughter who was learning to walk. Sarah asked about the daughter every time she passed him. An older cook named Bessa had bad knees and struggled with the stone stairs. Sarah never asked Bessa to bring anything to the East Wing. Instead, she went to the kitchen herself when she needed something, so that Bessa would not have to climb. The palace staff did not know what to make of her at first. The queen who was not really a queen, the enemy bride who asked for nothing and complained about nothing, and simply existed, quietly, in the East Wing with her garden and her early mornings. But people notice kindness, even when they do not say so out loud. There was a woman in the palace named Lyra. She was not nobility by blood, but she was the king's favored company at court, and that was better than any title. She was sharp and beautiful, and moved through the palace as though she owned it. She had noticed Sarah immediately, in the way that a person notices a potential threat, even when the threat does not know it is one. Lyra worked carefully to make sure the queen remained invisible. She mentioned to the right people that the Ashvale girl was simple, not very bright, not worth the king's attention. She made sure that when formal occasions arose, no one remembered to prepare a proper gown for Sarah. She made sure that any report or request that came from the East Wing was deprioritized or quietly set aside. It was very easy work. because the king was not paying attention to begin with. Aldrich governed his empire with complete focus. He attended councils, reviewed reports, managed disputes between pact territories, and spent what little personal time he had with the people whose company he found useful. Sarah was, in his mind, a political necessity that had been neatly placed in the East Wing and required nothing further from him. He passed her in the hallway once, 3 months after the wedding. She was carrying a small bundle of cut roses from the garden, and she stepped aside to let him pass. He walked by without slowing down. He did not look at her face. She watched him go, and then continued to the kitchen, where she left the roses in a clay pot on the windowsill, because Bessa had once mentioned that she liked flowers. What Aldrich did not know, could not know, because he had never thought to look, was that the palace was slowly changing around the quiet woman he had placed in the East Wing and forgotten. The rose garden, dead for 6 years, bloomed in the 4th month of Sarah's mournings. The guards on her corridor stood a little straighter, a little more settled, without being able to explain why. Fenrich's shaking hands, which had been worsening for 2 years from an illness none of the palace healers could name, began to improve. He mentioned to another guard that the queen brought him a small cup of warm tea every morning, with something in it that smelled like pine and sweet grass. He did not know what it was. His hands were steadier by the end of the month. 2 territorial disputes in the Western Pac regions, which had been sending increasingly hostile letters to the palace for over a year, went quiet. A trade agreement that had been stalled for 8 months was suddenly resolved. In both cases, witnesses remembered that a quiet woman had passed through, had spoken to both sides separately in private. No one thought to report it to the king. No one connected it to the queen. Old Elder Marin, who lived in a small set of rooms near the East Wing, because she was too old and too stubborn to be moved anywhere else, had been watching Sarah since the first week. She said nothing for 4 months. Then one evening, she knocked on Sarah's door and sat down across from her and looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "I know what you are." Sarah did not look up from the letter she was writing. She said, "No one is to know." Marin said, "Someone already does." Sarah was a Sylvain. It was a bloodline so rare that most people believed the lineage had died out entirely. Her Pax elders had known from the time she was a child, and they had been terrified of it. They had given her herbs every day since she was 7 years old to suppress what she carried, and they had trained her from childhood to be invisible, to be small, to be forgettable, so that no one would ever look closely enough to see what she was. A Sylvain could sense the truth in a lie. She could feel the weight of a person's grief or joy, the way another person might feel heat from a fire. She could communicate with the natural world in ways that the wolf packs had not been able to do for 200 years, and she was one of the only beings alive who could break a blood curse. The Vorn Empire had been dying under one for a decade. It started slowly, as these things do. The land became less fertile. Pack births declined. Wolves who had been strong and healthy began developing tremors, joint weakness, a slow dimming of their abilities. The curse had been laid by an old and bitter enemy, and it was woven into the earth itself. And Aldrich had spent 10 years trying to destroy it, with force and fire and sacrificial magic, and none of it had worked. His best healers had no answer. His oldest advisors had no solution. His empire was slowly weakening beneath him, and he could not stop it. The answer had been living in his East Wing for 6 months, tending a garden before dawn, and bringing tea to a guard with shaking hands. Marin urged Sarah to tell the king. Sarah refused. She had been used as a tool her entire life, offered up as a convenience, chosen because she was easy to spare. She would not walk to the man who had looked at her once in 4 minutes and offer herself as a solution to his problem. She would not do it. Whatever she had, whatever she was, it was hers, and she would decide when and whether to use it. 6 months after the wedding, the king held a formal court gathering. Protocol required the queen's attendance for the first time. Sarah arrived in the best dress she owned, which was not very fine, because no one had arranged anything better for her. Her hair was braided simply. She wore no jewels. She sat at the far end of the long table. Aldrich was at the head, and Lyra was near him, and the conversation flowed in the way that court conversation does, loud and self-important, and Sarah sat and watched and said nothing, which was what everyone expected of her. The arrow came through the high window above the king's left shoulder. Sarah was on her feet before the guards had registered the sound. She moved around the edge of the table in 3 steps and stepped directly in front of Aldrich. The arrow stopped. It hung in the air, trembling, less than 3 inches from her shoulder, and then it fell to the stone floor with a small, quiet sound. The room was completely silent. Sarah lowered her hand. Whatever light had gathered in her fingers was already gone. She stepped back, looked at the fallen arrow on the floor, and then looked up at the king. He was staring at her. It was the first time he had ever truly looked at her face. The assassin was caught before he reached the outer wall. Commander Dax, a hard and practical man who had served Aldrich for 15 years, ran the investigation personally. What he found made him go very still. Lyra had received a warning about the threat 4 days earlier, from a network of informants she maintained for her own use. She had not passed it to the king's guard. She had set it aside. The queen had received the same information 2 days before the event, through a source no one could quite explain, and had quietly sent a written note to the head of the palace guard. The note had been received, logged, and deprioritized. It sat in a pile of correspondence that had not yet been reviewed. Dax brought this to the king without softening it. Aldrich was quiet for a long time after hearing it. That night, he walked to the east wing for the first time. He knocked on Sarah's door. Pella answered, looked at him with wide eyes, and stepped back to let him in. Sarah was sitting at her desk, writing. She looked up when he entered, showed no particular surprise, and waited. He asked her why she had stepped in front of him. She looked at him carefully for a moment before she answered. Then she said, because it was the right thing to do, not because you deserve it, because I am not the kind of person who watches someone die when she can stop it. He did not know what to say to that. He had expected gratitude, or perhaps fear, or the performance of loyalty. He had not expected the truth, stated plainly, with no attempt to win anything from it. He began to pay attention after that. He spoke to Marin. He walked through the garden and looked at the roses. He spoke to Fenric, who showed him his steady hands and mentioned the tea. He read the reports from the Western Territories and asked careful questions until someone told him about the quiet woman who had spoken to both sides. He sat with the information for 3 days, and then he sat with the shame of it for 3 more. He had been given something extraordinary, and he had looked at it once and walked away. He tried to approach her. He invited her to meals, to council meetings, to morning walks in the garden she had built back to life. Sarah came when invited. She was polite. She answered questions when asked. She offered nothing more. She had spent 22 years learning not to need people. She was not going to unlearn it, because a man had finally decided she was worth looking at. The curse worsened. 3 pack territories went dark in a single week. Children were being born who could not access their wolf nature at all. The earth in the outer regions was cracking and dry, even in the rain. Aldrich called every resource he had. Nothing worked. Dax told him about Sarah. All of it. Everything Marin had explained. And then Dax said the thing that no one else had been willing to say. You had the answer living in your own palace, and you never thought she was worth asking. Aldrich went to the garden before dawn the next morning and sat on the stone bench and waited. When Sarah came out with her morning tea and found him there, she stopped walking. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, I did not come to ask you for anything. I came to tell you that I am sorry. You have quietly done more for this palace and these people than anyone in it, and I did not see you. I am sorry for that. She was quiet for a long moment. He did not try to fill the silence. Then she walked to the bench and sat down across from him, and she poured a second cup of tea from the pot she was carrying, and she set it in front of him. It took her 3 days to break the curse, and it nearly killed her. On the 3rd morning she collapsed in the garden, and when they carried her inside, the sky over the empire had changed. The crack in the earth in the outer territories closed. The wolves in the afflicted regions felt the change the moment it happened, a lifting, like a hand removed from a throat. The land began to breathe again. When Sarah opened her eyes, Aldrich was in the chair beside her bed. Pella told her later, quietly, that he had been there since she was carried in. He had not left. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He said, I did not ask you to do that. She said, I know. He said, you could have let it continue. I would not have blamed you. She said, I would have blamed myself. He was quiet. Then he said, is there anything you need? Anything I can give you? She thought about it seriously, as she thought about everything, slowly and honestly. Then she said, I would like to keep the garden. He said, it is yours. She said, and I would like to be spoken to like a person. He said, yes. She nodded and looked at the window, and the morning light was coming through it, and the roses outside were blooming in colors she had coaxed back into them over 6 months of quiet, patient work. The next morning, he was in the garden again. He asked if he could walk with her. She considered him for a moment, this king who had looked through her for half a year and was now learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to look at her properly. Then she said yes, and they walked together through the roses as the sun came up, and neither of them said very much, and that was enough to begin with.